Miss Marple and the Secret of the Hollow Locket, Chapter 1. A Death at the Garden Fadet. The Marleycombe summer fete was a beloved tradition, as dependable as the blooming of roses in Mrs. Hargreaves' front garden. Held every July on the vicarage lawn, it promised jam stalls, bunting, children's games, and the gentle clink of coins raised for the church roof fund. This year, the bunting fluttered proudly. The lemonade was pleasantly tart, and the weather thankfully was clear. Miss Marple, who rarely missed such a social occasion, sat beneath a cream parasol beside the sponge cake competition. She was knitting a pale blue baby bonnet, though she would later admit to a vague hope it might soon find use in the Bantry family, and keeping a quiet eye on the flow of villagers. "Did you see the locket she was wearing?" whispered Mrs. Edgecombe, leaning across the tea-table to her sister. "Quite ostentatious for a vicar's niece, if you ask me." Miss Marple didn't turn her head, but her fingers paused for the briefest moment. "That girl always seemed a little off," said her sister. "Came back from London suddenly, didn't she? After that unfortunate business with the theatre." The object of their scrutiny, Miss Clara Westbury, moved through the fete with the air of someone trying very hard to appear nonchalant. She was the vicar's niece, just returned from a life in London, claiming illness had brought her back to Marleycombe's slower pace. In truth, there had been vague whispers of something dramatic, perhaps a broken engagement or a scandalous argument. Backstage, Clara had been placed in charge of the raffle. She stood at a small table beside a tin of tickets and an antique silver bowl that was to be the prize. Around her neck hung a delicate gold chain bearing a curious little locket oval, old-fashioned and unusually warm. Odd little thing, that. "Locket," remarked Colonel Everett to Miss Marple, as he handed over 2 shillings for his tickets. "Saw her fiddling with it all morning." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often play with things that make them nervous, Colonel." The Colonel grunted. "She's hiding something, if you ask me." It wasn't long before the fete reached its cheerful peak. The raffle was drawn. A child spilled lemonade on the mayor's shoes, and the sponge cake prize was awarded, not this year, to Miss Marple, much to her mild amusement. Then came the scream. It rang out so suddenly, so sharply, that all motion froze. Was Mrs. Edgecombe's niece, pale and breathless, running from behind the church hall. Clara's collapsed by the vestry. Steps. Several people rushed at once. Miss Marple did not run, but she did set down her knitting and follow calmly, weaving through the crowd with steady steps. Clara Westbury lay crumpled beside the stone steps, her raffle tickets scattered like confetti. One gloved hand still clutched at her locket. Her face, waxy and gray, was turned slightly to the side. A faint trickle of something lemonade ran from the corner of her mouth. But as Dr. Matthews bent over her and lifted her wrist, the crowd knew the truth before he spoke. "She's dead," he said quietly. "Must have been sudden. No sign of injury?" asked Colonel Everett. "None at all." There was silence, then a ripple of whispered words. "Heart failure. Poor girl. So young. And what a shock." But Miss Marple, who knelt briefly beside the body with a frown between her brows, gently lifted the gold locket and examined it. The clasp was broken. Inside was a photograph, too faded to see clearly, and something else, something she did not yet understand. A tiny scrap of dark red cloth folded behind the image. The police were summoned. Statements were taken. And by tea-time, the fete had emptied in quiet dismay, the bunting fluttering above abandoned stalls. That night, in her small front parlor, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched in her lap. Her mind turned, not to Clara's death, that would be explained soon enough. Everyone seemed to agree, but to the way Clara had looked at the crowd earlier that day, as though someone frightened her, as though she had something to say, but dared not, and to the curious locket, the broken clasp, the red cloth. "Clara Westbury," she murmured, "what were you trying to hold on to?" Outside, the still summer air carried only the chirp of crickets and the distant toll of the church bell. But in Marleycombe, something darker than evening had settled in. Chapter 2. The girl who knew too much. The following morning in Marleycombe was unusually hushed, as though the village itself had drawn in a collective breath and held it. The shops opened late. The vicar's bell, which usually rang cheerfully for morning prayers, sounded instead like a muted lament. Word of Clara Westbury's sudden death had traveled quickly, as such news always does in small villages, and by breakfast everyone had an opinion. Miss Marple, however, had no interest in opinions. She had seen too many tragedies, softened by conjecture and spoiled by gossip. And this was not the death of an elderly resident in their sleep, nor an accident by the roadside. A young woman had collapsed in daylight, with dozens of eyes watching only minutes before, and Clara Westbury, it seemed, had not been well liked. "She always had that air of knowing things she shouldn't," said Mrs. Hargreaves at the greengrocer's, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never trusted a girl who smiled with her mouth, and not her eyes." "She was too friendly with Mr. Leonard Cross," added Miss Peabody, who ran the bookshop. "Far too friendly, and he's a married man." By mid-morning, Inspector Caldwell had arrived from the county station in Charnbury. A neat, methodical man with a habit of drumming his fingers against his belt, he seemed unimpressed by village drama. He interviewed the vicar first, then Clara's physician, and then quietly requested a post-mortem. Purely routine, he told the village, though the words were not convincing. By noon, Miss Marple was in her garden, pruning lavender, when a shadow appeared on the other side of the hedge. "Miss Marple?" She looked up. It was Lucy Barton, a young girl of 17, with anxious eyes and ink-stained fingers. She was the daughter of Marleycombe's schoolteacher, and had always been an observant, if quiet, girl. "Lucy, dear, come in, won't you?" Lucy stepped into the garden, but did not sit. Her hands twisted nervously. I think I need to tell someone about something I saw yesterday." Miss Marple set down her shears. "Go on, my dear. Take your time." "I was behind the vestry during the raffle, sketching. I like to draw birds, and the fate gets too loud sometimes." "Yes?" "I saw Clara talking to someone. A man. I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a dark hat, and standing, too, far back by the yew tree. But they were arguing. Not loud, just very tense." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you hear what they said?" "Not everything. Just one thing. She said, 'I still have it, and if anything happens to me, they'll know the truth.'" Lucy's eyes filled with frightened tears. "Miss Marple, do you think someone hurt her?" Miss Marple reached across and gently took the girl's hand. "My dear child," she said softly, "thank you for telling me. What you saw may be very important, but don't worry yourself just yet. I believe Clara was trying to protect something or someone, and she may have left us a clue." Lucy's brow furrowed. "The locket?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, the locket." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. The Reverend George Wexley was a kindly man, if a bit absent-minded, and visibly shaken by his niece's death. "I'm afraid I cannot offer you tea," he said as he ushered her into the parlor. "Everything seems so unreal." "Of course," Miss Marple replied gently. "I shan't stay long. I only wanted to ask, do you happen to know where Clara got her locket?" He blinked. "The locket? Oh, yes," she said. "It was a family keepsake. From her mother's side, I believe. She was quite fond of it." "Did she ever open it in front of you?" He frowned. No. She kept it rather private. Said it reminded her of someone she once knew. Never elaborated." Miss Marple nodded. her mind already working. A keepsake, a secret, a photograph, and a scrap of red cloth. The village returned slowly to its routines, but something darker had taken root beneath the surface. Miss Marple stood at her front window that evening, watching the sun fade over Marleycomb's rooftops. The first piece of the puzzle had revealed itself, not the cause of Clara's death, but the knowledge that she had feared it. And when a person fears for their life, it is very rarely without reason. Chapter 4. The Photograph That Vanished. Next morning brought gray skies to Marleycombe, and with them a sense of heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with her usual pot of Earl Grey and a slice of oat toast. But instead of reaching for the sugar, she reached for Clara's old school register, a dusty volume she'd quietly borrowed from the vicar's office under the pretense of helping with parish records. Clara Westbury had been a quiet girl, bright but withdrawn. Her attendance had been regular until she was 14 then. Quite suddenly, there had been a 6-week absence. No explanation listed, just a dash on the page. Odd, Miss Marple murmured. People often forget that events which seem unimportant at the time can shape everything that comes later. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way to the home of Dr. Matthews, Marleycomb's long-serving physician and unofficial keeper of local secrets. The doctor was in his study, hunched over paperwork when she arrived. His office, though cluttered, was clean, and the faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. "Miss Marple," he said, rising. "A pleasure. What brings you here?" "I won't stay long," she said with a kind smile. "I just had a small question about Clara Westbury. More historical than medical, I'm afraid." Dr. Matthews looked intrigued. "Go on. Do you recall anything unusual about Clara's health as a child? A long absence from school, perhaps?" The doctor's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, yes. 14 or so, wasn't it? There was some kind of breakdown. Emotional distress, I believe. Her mother insisted on keeping it quiet. Sent her to stay with an aunt in Devon. Was anything reported? An injury, perhaps? A trauma?" He hesitated. There were bruises on her back and wrists. "I asked the mother, but she claimed Clara had fallen from a ladder. The girl herself wouldn't speak." Miss Marple pressed her lips together, then nodded. "Thank you, doctor. That confirms a few things." As she stepped back out into the cool morning, her mind was turning. Bruises, silence, a missing piece of Clara's life, and a vanished photograph. The locket had contained something valuable enough to steal even from a dead woman. It had been carefully hidden. Clara had said as much. "If anything happens to me, they'll know the truth." But someone had made very sure no one would. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Rosehill Lane, where Margaret Cross lived alone for the moment the solicitor's wife opened the door only a few inches. Her eyes were red, her voice brittle. "I'm not receiving visitors." "I understand completely," Miss Marple said. "But I do believe you're in danger, my dear. And I never ignore a danger to a woman, especially when men are trying to keep her in the dark." The door paused, then opened wider. Inside, Margaret led her to a small sitting room where a cup of untouched tea had long gone cold. She sat stiffly, arms crossed. "I suppose you've come about Leonard." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I've come about Clara." Margaret's expression hardened. She was in love with him. Everyone knew, and he didn't say no. He never says no. "Did he give her the locket?" Margaret looked startled. "No, that belonged to Clara's mother, I think. Leonard hated it, said it was hideous and old-fashioned." "I see. Do you happen to know if Leonard left Fate at any point?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "No, he didn't. Leave, but there was a man." I saw him from the raffle tent, standing near the back wall, watching Clara. She paused. When I looked again, he was gone. Miss Marple leaned forward. Was Clara afraid of Leonard? Margaret's voice was quiet. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly, but she knew something. Something she kept over his head. And if she threatened to tell? Margaret looked down. He'd have panicked. He's a proud man. He always finds a way to clean up his messes. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew the folded sketch Lucy had made. Does this look familiar? Margaret stared at the page for several seconds, then whispered, That's not Leonard. No, Miss Marple agreed. But whoever it is, I believe Clara trusted him once. And he destroyed that trust. Margaret stood, almost abruptly. She said something odd to me once. We were alone at the post office. She said, People always think the past is dead, but sometimes it just wears a new face. Miss Marple nodded slowly. How very like Clara. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened her journal and made 3 small notes. Photograph missing from Locket, Clara, bruised at 14. Never explained. The past wears a new face. She underlined the last one dot in Miss Marple's experience. That was never a metaphor. Not in a village like Marley Combe Dot. It was a warning. Chapter 5. A face from the past the following day brought. With it the sharp smell of cut grass, and the faint rustle of newspapers passed from neighbor to neighbor. The local paper had run a discreet obituary for Clara Westbury, beloved niece of Reverend George Wexley, taken too soon, fondly remembered. There was no mention of the locket, or the man behind the vestry, or the bruises Clara had hidden. So well, but Miss Marple remembered. And more importantly, she noticed what the obituary didn't say. Clara's father was not named, nor was any surviving family apart from the vicar mentioned. That, in itself, was unusual. In villages like Marleycombe, everyone belonged to someone. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, sipping lukewarm tea, a faded photograph spread before her. It was from a church picnic in 1906, one of her old collections. A fondness of hers that had more than once helped the police piece together family lines no one remembered. In the lower right corner, partially obscured by a child's wide hat, was a man she now looked at with new interest. Thick, dark brows, a long nose, a strong jawline. Unmistakable if one knew what to look for. She rose, folded the photograph into her notebook, and walked to Marleycombe's little library, where the village records were kept in a back room that smelled of paper. And lavender polished. There, over the course of an hour, Miss Marple traced a thin and troubling thread. A man named James Branson, music hall actor, had lived in Marleycombe briefly in the early 1900s. He had been involved in a scandal with a young woman, one Eliza Westbury, Clara's mother. Branson had left abruptly, no charges pressed, and Eliza married a quiet church clerk soon after. But the scandal hadn't disappeared. It had grown roots. And now, perhaps those roots had returned. That afternoon, Inspector Caldwell came to Miss Marple's cottage, looking more tired than usual. We identified the man in the sketch, he said. Or at least, we have a name. Oh? Rupert Ashe, former stage actor, mostly minor roles. Did a stint with the London Civic Players 10 years ago. Disappeared for a while. Recently turned up working under a different name, James Renshaw, as a piano teacher in Charnbury. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Rupert Ashe, she repeated. Or James Branson? Caldwell blinked. Pardon? Inspector, I believe your Mr. Ashe is the same man who went by James Branson decades ago. I believe. He is Clara Westbury's father. Caldwell stared. Her father? Yes. He abandoned Clara's mother under highly distressing circumstances. And now he's returned, possibly to stop Clara from revealing something that would damage him. Caldwell sank into an armchair. My God, she had something on him. The locket, perhaps. A photograph, certainly. Maybe a record of his real name, and she made the mistake of warning him. Why now? Caldwell asked. Why would he care after all these years? Because Clara had discovered the truth, Miss Marple said. And she wasn't the kind of woman to stay silent forever. He knew that. She must have threatened to go public or worse, tell Leonard Cross, who, let's not forget, may have had his own reasons to keep Clara quiet. Caldwell rubbed his chin. We've got 2 men with motive. Yes, Miss Marple said. And I believe one of them has blood on his hands. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the hedgerows turned silver in the moonlight, Miss Marple sat with her lamp low, writing a letter to an old acquaintance in London, a retired theater director with a long memory and a longer list of names. She signed it carefully, sealed it with wax, and smiled faintly. One way or another, the past was coming back. But this time, Miss Marple would be waiting. Chapter 6. A letter never sent 3 days after Clara Westbury's funeral, Marley Combe began to breathe again. The shops stayed open later, children played hopscotch outside the bakery, and the vicar resumed his usual walking route with his Bible tucked under one arm. But beneath the surface, unease still simmered. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let unease lie dormant for long. That morning, a discreet envelope arrived on her breakfast tray, delivered not by post but by hand. The handwriting was tight and old-fashioned. The return address from London. Inside was a single page. My dear Jane, you were quite right to inquire. Rupert Ashe and James Branson are one and the same. I recognized the voice before I saw the face. Changed his name twice first after that affair in Leeds, and again after the scandal with Eliza Westbury. He was always slippery, charming to some, cruel to others. We suspected blackmail once. As for Clara, I never met her, but I'm sorry she's gone. Yours, Arthur Pendleton, Retired Civic Players Trust. Miss Marple folded the letter with a soft sigh. It confirmed what she had long suspected. Clara had known the truth about her father, and he had come to Marley Combe, not to reconcile, but to silence her. But that still left one puzzle unsolved. What had Clara meant to do with the information? Surely she hadn't worn the locket around her neck every day without intention. Miss Marple needed to know more about Clara's final days. By midday, she was seated in Clara's former bedroom at the vicarage, with Reverend Wexley's blessing. The vicar, grateful for her discretion, had even brought up the tea himself. The room was modest. Lace curtains, a small vanity, a shelf of worn paperbacks, and a desk that had clearly once belonged to a child. But Miss Marple's eyes went immediately to the writing table by the window. The ink bottle was dry, the blotting paper fresh, and tucked into the drawer, folded inside a book of Tennyson's poetry, was a single unsent letter. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. It was written in Clara's hand. Margaret, there are things I need to tell you. About Leonard, about my mother, and about the man who's come back to Marley Combe under another name. I can't carry it anymore. You once said I should forget the past, but I can't. I've seen his face. He's dangerous. He'll do it again. If anything happens to me, please tell the police to look inside the locket. You'll know which photo. Clara. Miss Marple stared at the final sentence. You'll know which photo. And yet there had been no photograph inside the locket when the police opened it. Only Miss Marple had seen it briefly. A man's face, blurred by time and age, but unmistakable. She now believed that photo had been the original James Branson, captured in a candid moment, kept hidden by Clara for years. The killer had known precisely what to remove. She folded the letter gently and placed it into her handbag. Outside the vicarage, the wind had picked up. The air smelled of earth and thunder. Marley Combe's peaceful facade trembled just slightly as storm clouds gathered over the fields. Miss Marple made her way through the village, her steps measured. Her next stop was Leonard Cross's office. The solicitor had returned after several days of unexplained absence. His wife was still gone. She found him behind his desk, papers strewn about, eyes sunken. "Miss Marple," he said, "I won't pretend I'm glad to see you. I rarely expect such things," she said, seating herself. "I came to ask you about Clara, about whether you knew who her real father was." Cross's face paled slightly. "I knew she didn't belong here," he said after a long pause. "I knew she came with secrets, but I didn't know that. She trusted you, you know," Miss Marple said, "even when she feared what you might do." "I never meant to hurt her," he said softly. "I just wanted her gone." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "That's a very dangerous kind of wanting, Mr. Cross." He looked up. "Do you think I killed her?" "I think someone did," she replied. "And that person knew exactly what they were taking when they opened that locket." She placed the folded letter on his desk. "This," she said, "is what she meant to send your wife." Cross stared at it, but didn't touch it. "She was going to tell the truth, you see," Miss Marple added gently. "All of it." He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. In that silence, Miss Marple saw what she needed. Guilt, not for murder, but for silence. For cowardice. She rose to go. "One more question, Mr. Cross," she said at the door. "Do you happen to know whether Rupert Ashe, or should I say, James Branson, has a key to the church vestry?" Cross's eyes widened. "No," he said. "But he used to. Before he vanished 30 years ago, he was a caretaker for a few months." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Then I believe I know where he went after the fete." That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple laid out her notes. Once more, Clara's father had returned under a false name. Clara had tried to warn someone, her closest ally. The photograph had vanished, but the man hadn't. She circled one word again and again, colon vecry. And then, quite suddenly, she stood, took her coat, and walked into the night. Because if she was right, he might still be hiding there. Chapter 7. Beneath the church floorboards, the wind whispered low across Marleycomb's gravestones as Miss Marple approached St. Anne's Church under cover of darkness. Her coat flapped softly against her skirt, and in her gloved hand she carried a small brass torch, not too bright, but enough for careful navigation. The church doors were locked, of course, but Miss Marple had already thought of that. Years ago, she had volunteered with the flower rota and had been given a spare key to the vestry, which she had never returned. The vicar, she reasoned, would have approved if he knew what was at stake. She let herself in through the side entrance and stepped into the cool hush of the nave. The stained glass windows looked black and blind in the moonlight. She moved slowly toward the vestry, torch low, footsteps silent on the worn stone floor. Inside the vestry, the air was thick with dust and candle wax. A line of cassocks hung on a wooden rail. In one corner, a small table bore the remnants of the fate raffle tickets. Clara's table. Miss Marple moved toward it, examining the space around the base of the wall. Her eyes searched the floor, where the stone gave way to old wood. And there, beneath the farthest cassock, she saw it. Narrow, uneven gap in the floorboards, barely visible unless one was looking for it. She bent down, knees creaking, and shone her light into the crack. There was something tucked underneath. With surprising agility, she reached in with her fingers and pulled it out. A faded envelope, sealed, and inside her breath caught slightly a photograph. Cracked with age, but intact. The same face from Lucy's sketch, the same face she had glimpsed in the locket. A man in mid-laugh, seated at a piano, hand on the shoulder of a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The handwriting on the back read, "To Clara, from your loving father, J.B." So Clara had made a copy and hidden it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Clever girl. A sound behind her, the creak of a door. She turned sharply just as the shadow stepped into the vestry. Rupert Ashe, or James Branson. Whatever name he was using now, he looked different than before, hollow-eyed, hair damp with sweat, a trace of panic around the edges. "You shouldn't be here?" he said, voice hoarse. "I might say the same of you," Miss Marple replied. Calmly. He took a step closer. "Give me the photograph." "No." He stopped. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said quickly. "I just needed the locket. She wouldn't give it to me. She said she'd go to the police. She said she knew what I'd done." "What had you done, Mr. Branson?" Miss Marple asked softly. His mouth opened, closed. Then he laughed bitterly. She didn't even know the worst of it. "I ruined her mother's life. I left a child behind. And she found me again. After all these years?" "You drugged her," Miss Marple said. "Didn't you?" He didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "I didn't want to kill her," he said, "just to frighten her. But she fell. I tried to help her, I did. But then I saw the locket. So you took the evidence." He nodded, breathing heavily. "I thought no one else knew." Miss Marple stepped backward, just enough to place her hand on the shelf behind her. "Well, you were wrong," she said, raising her voice slightly. Footsteps echoed in the corridor behind the vestry. A moment later, Inspector Caldwell stepped in, flanked by a constable. Rupert Ashe froze. Miss Marple turned calmly toward the inspector. "I believe you'll find your man," she said. "And the missing photograph. Clara left it here, where he once had the keys, but no longer the right." That night, back at home, Miss Marple finally finished her cold cup of tea. Clara Westbury had died, protecting the truth quietly, bravely. But she had not died in vain. Miss Marple reached into her pocket and unfolded the photograph once more. Smiling man. The child. And in the smile of that little girl, a trace of justice not yet finished. Chapter 8. The calm after the storm. The next morning, Marleycombe woke to the sound of birdsong and a police motor car idling quietly outside the church. News of Rupert Ashe's arrest traveled like wildfire, though few in the village knew his true name, and even fewer understood the full weight of what had occurred. But Miss Marple knew. So did Inspector Caldwell, who arrived at her cottage mid-morning, with a tired smile and 2 cups of strong tea from the bakery. "You have a remarkable talent for finding trouble, Miss Marple," he said, handing her a cup. "I don't seek it out," she said modestly. "It tends to find me, especially when the truth is being so poorly hidden." Caldwell sat down heavily in the garden chair. He confessed in the end. Said he panicked when Clara recognized him. She confronted him at the fate told him she'd go to the police, expose what he did to her mother and what he tried to do to her. "Did he say what was in the drink?" she asked. "Crushed sleeping tablets. He brought them in a bottle of lemonade, pretended it was one she'd left behind earlier in the day. Said he just wanted her to faint long enough for him to get the locket and disappear." "But her heart gave out," Miss Marple said quietly. Caldwell nodded. "We believe the combination of stress, the heat, and the sedative was too much. It stopped her heart before he realized anything was wrong. He tried to make it look natural, but when he saw you kneel by the body, he panicked." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "That explains why the locket was missing. He took it the moment he realized she was gone." "And yet," Caldwell said with admiration, "you still found the real photograph, hidden under the vestry floorboards." "She trusted the wrong man," Miss Marple replied. "But she didn't trust him completely." There was a moment of silence between them. "She was quite brave," Caldwell said finally. "Yes," Miss Marple said. Quite. Later that day, Clara's things were packed away in quiet boxes and stored in the church's attic. The vicar, sorrowful and subdued, led a small evening prayer service for her, this time attended by people who now knew how much she had carried, and how little they had truly seen Margaret Cross return to the village that evening. She stood beside Miss Marple in the garden of the vicarage after the service. The two women watching the dusk settle across the graves. She told me once that she envied me, Margaret said softly, for having a quiet life. But I think she was stronger than I ever could be. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on hers. Strength doesn't always shout, my dear. Sometimes it's just the quiet courage to tell the truth. Margaret nodded. Leonard's resigning from the firm. He's going to stay with his sister for a while. Perhaps that's best, Miss Marple said. They stood a while longer, watching the candles flicker through the church windows. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, a fresh pot of tea beside her, her knitting in her lap. She did not need recognition. She did not need thanks. But as she looked over her notes one final time, she allowed herself a quiet sense of peace. The truth had been told. Clara Westbury had not died in vain. And somewhere beyond the veil of secrecy and scandal, justice had at last been served. Chapter 9. A second whisper. 3 days had passed since Rupert Ascham's Branson was taken into custody. Marley Combe, content with the simplicity of closure, returned quickly to its gentle rhythms. Gossip softened into memory. The church bells rang at proper times once more, but Miss Marple wasn't satisfied. The problem, she told herself as she swept crumbs from her tea tray, was that the story fit too neatly. Clara confronts her estranged father. He panics. He slips something in her drink. She dies. He takes the locket. Case closed. Only Miss Marple didn't quite believe in closed if the pieces didn't all align, and one piece most certainly did not. That morning, a note had been slipped under her door. Anonymous. No envelope. Just 6 hurried words scrawled in pencil on the back of a grocer's receipt. She wasn't alone in the vestry. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment. The handwriting was unfamiliar, clearly rushed. She flipped the receipt over dates and a list of items. Barley, milk, tinned. Peaches. Likely from Collins Grocers on the east side of the village. The voice of Lucy Barton echoed in her memory. They were arguing. Not loud, just very tense. Not he. They. Miss Marple had assumed it was Clara and her father. But what if there had been someone else in the vestry and she collapsed? By afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking the long path to the Barton cottage. Lucy, always curious and careful, opened the door with wide eyes. Miss Marple? I've come to ask a rather peculiar question, my dear, she said. It's about the fate. You said Clara argued with a man, the one in the hat. Lucy nodded. Yes, I drew him. Did anyone else go behind the vestry that day? Even for a moment? Lucy frowned. Yes, I think so. Mrs. Denning. She's the one who sets up the flowers for the altar. She went around the back with a box of vases and came back maybe 10 minutes later. Why? Did you hear anything? Lucy paused, trying to remember. Not clearly. But I thought I heard a door slam, like someone left in a hurry. I assumed it was the man. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Lucy. You've been more helpful than you know. Mrs. Denning, a tall, angular woman with a fondness for chrysanthemums and conspiracies, was pruning her rose bush when Miss Marple arrived. Terrible business. That girl's death, she said before Miss Marple could even greet her. I said. From the start, she was hiding something. Yes, quite, Miss Marple said. I believe you were behind the vestry just before Clara died? Mrs. Denning straightened. Well, yes. The church keys are kept in the sacristy box. I had to fetch a vase, walked right past Clara. She looked flushed. "Did you see anyone else?" Mrs. Denning hesitated. "Now you mention it, I did hear voices. Not angry, but sharp. One was Clara, the other. I thought it was a man. But it could have been Margaret Cross. She has a low voice when she's upset. And I did see her in the churchyard earlier than most. Said she was looking for her husband." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Did she go inside the vestry?" "I believe so. She came from that direction." "Before or after Clara was found?" "Before." That night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes again. She added a new entry. Clara was not alone. Margaret Cross may have been there. And suddenly, the true timeline began to shift. Suppose Margaret had found Clara behind the church. Suppose she'd learned what her husband had done, or what Clara had threatened to reveal. Suppose there had been a confrontation, and suppose someone else had delivered the fatal blow or the fatal drink after Margaret left. Could it be that both Margaret and Rupert Ashe were guilty? Or was the real truth still hiding behind yet another smile? Miss Marple closed her notebook with a quiet sigh. She had solved the murder once already. Now she would have to solve it again. Chapter 10. What the flowers covered Miss Marple did not. Sleep well that night. Her dreams were filled with blurred faces, locked doors, and Clara's voice soft but persistent repeating the phrase, "You'll know which photo." When she rose before dawn, the skies over Marleycombe were thick with summer mist. The village was still, dew resting quietly on hedgerows and stone walls. Miss Marple, shawl wrapped around her shoulders and resolve in her step, headed for the Quai. One place the police had already dismissed, the vestry. Again she arrived before morning mass and let herself in with her old key. The wooden beams groaned above her head as she moved with careful steps toward the corner where the raffle table had stood. Something had been bothering her ever since Lucy mentioned it, the slamming door. The vestry had only one real exit. But there was also a flower hatch, a small wooden panel used to pass flowers from the outside garden directly into the church's altar area. It was almost never locked, and rarely noticed. Miss Marple crossed to it now and ran her fingers along the edge. The panel creaked open with a dry sigh. Inside, just barely out of sight, was something wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it free and unwrapped it with trembling hands. Inside, a second locket. This one was different. Older, silver, not gold, and still locked tight. Miss Marple's breath caught. She turned it over. On the back was a shallow engraving. To EW-1909. I'll never forget. Eliza Westbury, Clara's mother. Inside this locket, once opened, was not a photo, but a folded scrap of sheet music. Ink faded, but legible. The top read, Branson, London Civic, March 1909. The red dress confession aria. Miss Marple stared. This wasn't just a keepsake. This was proof that Branson had written and performed a piece confessing to something. Possibly something he'd later erased. And Clara had found it. A second layer of blackmail? A second motive? Or a clue left not by Clara, but by her mother? By mid-morning, Miss Marple stood once again in Inspector Caldwell's office. He held the locket in gloved hands, examining the inscription. "This proves Branson and Eliza had a more serious history than we thought," he said. "If this was hers, why was it hidden behind the flower hatch?" "Because someone else was here that day," Miss Marple said. "And they didn't have time to escape out the main door. So they slipped the locket through the hatch and returned, later to collect it. Only they never did." Caldwell narrowed his eyes. "And who would know the hatch even existed?" Miss Marple answered softly. "Someone who arranged flowers for the altar." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Denning for tea. The woman came promptly. all smiles and strong perfume. "You've had quite the week, Jane," she said, setting down her gloves. "The whole village is buzzing." "I'm sure." "They are," Miss Marple said with a pleasant smile. "Do have a scone." As they sat, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward flowers. Mrs. Denning, as expected, lit up. "Oh yes, I've done the church flowers for 17 years. Easter lily, Christmas pine, fate marigolds, you name it. And of course, you'd be familiar with the flower hatch." Mrs. Denning's hand paused mid-teacup. "Oh yes, though we barely use it anymore." "Curious," Miss Marple said, "because someone used it recently, to hide something rather significant." Mrs. Denning said nothing. "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "did you know Eliza Westbury? Before she became Mrs. Westbury?" Mrs. Denning's eyes hardened. "I knew her, yes." "And did you know that she carried a child, Clara, after James Branson left?" There was a long silence. Then, "I did," she said. "We all did. But no one said anything. Not back then." "You didn't say those things? And did you know that Branson wrote a song and aria where he confessed to more than just abandoning her?" Mrs. Denning's voice was very soft now. "He hurt her, Eliza. That's why she disappeared for a season. That's why Clara was born in secret. And Clara found out," Miss Marple said. "She planned to expose it. She wore the gold locket with his picture, but she also carried her mother's hidden, until someone forced her to give it up." Mrs. Denning's face was pale. "I didn't kill her. I swear to you." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, "but I also believe you saw more than you've admitted. You saw Margaret Cross enter the vestry, and you knew she came back out alone. You knew Clara had already collapsed, and yet you said nothing." Mrs. Denning looked away. "I owed Eliza," she whispered. "Not Clara, Eliza." Miss Marple stood and walked to the window. "She may not have killed Clara, Mrs. Denning, but Margaret was there. And she may have done more than just confront her." That evening, Miss Marple made one final note in her journal. Branson poisoned her. But he wasn't the only one who wanted her silent. Because Clara's story, it seemed, was not about one killer. It was about two people neither of whom wanted the truth to survive. And now, Miss Marple would need to prove it. Chapter 11. The shattered teacup Margaret Cross had always moved through Marleycombe, like a breeze, quiet, well-dressed, gracious in public, and curiously absent from gossip. People admired her composure. Her silence was mistaken for dignity. Miss Marple, however, had always known that silence can be a fortress or a prison. That afternoon, she arrived at the Cross residence, now markedly emptier. Leonard had departed for his sister's estate in Home, Hampshire. The blinds were half drawn. Margaret herself answered the door, her expression unreadable. "I was expecting you," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Then I won't pretend this is just a social visit." They sat in the parlor. The teacups were already out. The one bore a faint chip along the rim. Margaret poured without a word. Miss Marple waited until the sugar had been stirred. "I believe," she said calmly, "you were the last person to speak with Clara Westbury while she was still alive." Margaret's hand trembled ever so slightly. "You're mistaken." "I didn't—" "She mentioned you in her letter," Miss Marple interrupted, gently but firmly. "She trusted you, and she asked for your help." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple continued. "You followed her behind the vestry. You argued. Perhaps not loudly, but you were angry. Clara threatened to reveal something about Leonard, and you panicked." "I didn't." "Kill her," Margaret said quickly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I believe you thought she was already dead when you left her." Margaret blinked. "You found her collapsed, didn't you?" Miss Marple said softly. "Slumped beside the raffle table, a lemonade bottle nearby. You knelt beside her, but she was barely breathing. Margaret's voice cracked. I thought she'd taken something. I didn't know what to do. You saw the locket, Miss Marple pressed. And the second? One her mother's. Perhaps it fell from her purse. You panicked again. I thought, Margaret's eyes welled. I thought if the police found it, it would come back to Leonard. To us. To everything we'd buried. So you took it, Miss Marple said. Not to protect a killer, but to protect a reputation. Margaret bowed her head. And when Rupert Ashe Branson came to you later that evening, Miss Marple added he demanded it back. Margaret looked up sharply. How did you? Miss Marple folded her hands. Because you're not the only one he visited. He wanted every copy of that photograph. Every scrap of proof. And he believed you had Clara's original locket. Margaret was trembling now. He came to the back door. Said if I didn't give it to him, he'd drag Leonard into it all. He knew things. Horrible things. I gave him the gold locket and hid the other. Behind the flower hatch. Margaret nodded. Silently Miss Marple sat back. Thank you, Mrs. Cross. That's all I needed to confirm. Margaret looked confused. What happens now? Miss Marple stood. That's up to Inspector Caldwell. You'll be asked to give a full statement. You didn't cause Clara's death, but you did obstruct justice. That carries consequences. Margaret's voice broke. I just wanted it all to go away. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. That's what everyone wanted. And that's what killed her. That evening, Inspector Caldwell sat across from Miss Marple once again, notebook in hand. So Margaret confirmed it? Miss Marple nodded. She found Clara just after the poison took hold, took the locket, hid the second. Didn't say a word until Branson came looking. Caldwell sighed. That complicates things. Still, Branson administered the drug. That's murder. Indeed, Miss Marple said. But you'll find Margaret's fingerprints on the second locket. And her prints are the only reason we ever found it at all. Caldwell looked up. You think she wanted to be caught? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly. I think, she said, that Clara wasn't the only one tired of secrets. Chapter 12. The man from Leeds. It rained the next morning, one of those steady, whispering English rains that fell like confession. Marleycombe streets turned slick, and the scent of damp hedgerows filled the air. Most villagers stayed indoors, but Miss Marple had a visitor. He arrived just after 10, his trench coat dripping on her welcome mat. A thin man in his 60s, he removed his hat with quiet deference and introduced himself with a Yorkshire accent. Miss Marple? I'm Chief Inspector Derek Fielding, retired now, but once of the Leeds Constabulary. I believe you sent me a letter. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. I hoped you might still be alive and still remember a man named James Branson. Fielding gave a thin smile. Hard to forget. Slick fellow. Left a trail of broken promises and a few broken lives behind him. We always suspected him of more than what we could prove. He reached into his coat and drew out a faded brown envelope. Inside was a single folded document. A deposition, he said, from a woman named Agnes Weller. She was a seamstress in Leeds, claimed Branson using the name Rupert Ashfield, then drugged her after she refused to give up a personal letter he'd written. The case fell apart when she withdrew the statement, too frightened. Sighed she'd been warned. Miss Marple took the paper carefully. She survived? Fielding nodded, but she vanished. Went to ground in Kent. Disappeared off the grid. Miss Marple scanned the paper. The handwriting was spidery, but strong. He said if I didn't forget it, he'd make me forget it. I think he's done it before. Underneath, the name, Agnes Weller. Date, 1911. Miss Marple looked up. Then Clara wasn't the first. Fielding sat back, and likely wouldn't have been the last. Later that day, Inspector Caldwell studied the new evidence with folded arms and a creased brow. "We can't charge a dead man with old crimes," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But we can understand what Clara died trying to expose." Caldwell sighed. "There's more. Forensics just finished with the second locket, the one you found. Inside the hinge, they recovered a fragment of sheet music parchment soaked in perfume, hidden between the layers. Clara must have found it inside her mother's keepsake," Miss Marple said. "Eliza had hidden part of Branson's original aria, the confession, the one he later tried to erase." Caldwell nodded. "And now we have a sample in his handwriting, dated, named, all of it. But more importantly," Miss Marple said, "we have the proof that Clara wasn't blackmailing him for money. She was trying to make his crimes known. She wanted justice for her mother. And that," Caldwell said, "is what killed her." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again with Margaret Cross. The woman had agreed to speak to the police, and a statement had been recorded. There would be no formal charges, only a quiet understanding that silence could not always be excused. Margaret held the original sheet music in her lap now, trembling. "This was what she found?" she asked. "This song?" "It wasn't just a song," Miss Marple said gently. "It was his confession, cloaked in music, and your husband knew about it." Margaret looked up sharply. "Leonard? He represented Branson's finances briefly, didn't he? In the early years?" Margaret nodded. "They said it was just a legal favor, nothing significant." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I think Leonard knew something. Not all, but enough to panic when Clara started asking questions. Enough to want her quieted. And when he couldn't, he turned the blind eye." Margaret looked away. "I don't know if Leonard will return," she said. "I don't know if I want him to." Miss Marple rose to leave. "That choice, my dear, is yours. But at least now you have all the truth you were denied for so long." Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for not stopping with the easy answer." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were lifting God, but Miss Marple, walking home through the soft mud of Marleycomb's lanes, knew the story was still unfinished, because Clara Westbury had paid the price for telling the truth. And Miss Marple would make sure the truth reached every ear willing to hear it. Chapter 13. The proof in print. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, postmarked London, tucked among seed catalogues and the church newsletter. Miss Marple opened it over breakfast, her toast untouched. It was from Penelope Drake, editor of the Woman's Chronicle, a small but reputable monthly devoted to social justice, historical injustices, and women's voices. Miss Marple had written to her quietly, enclosing a copy of Clara's story, the Locket photographs, the sheet music fragment, and a carefully composed letter of context leaving out names, but not truths. Penelope's reply was crisp, enthusiastic, and determined. "Miss Marple, this is extraordinary, sad, brave, and utterly true. I'd be honored to print it. Anonymized, of course, but the message will not be lost. We'll call it The Hollow Locket, a daughter's silence, a mother's secret. It will be the centerpiece of next month's issue. Yours in truth, P.D." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. She was pleased, but not relieved. Because truth, once printed, becomes dangerous again. By Friday, the whispers had begun. Miss Marple heard them in the bakery queue, on the vicarage path, and once amusingly from behind her in the pews at church. "She's sending something to London. Poor Clara, God rest her. Well, I don't see why we can't just move on." The story was spreading before the article even appeared, but one person wasn't whispering. He was acting. That evening, as Miss Marple returned from the greengrocer, she found her gate slightly ajar. Nothing was missing. But on her desk inside, where she had left her papers carefully stacked, The envelope containing the original sheet music fragment was gone. She stood still, scanning the room. Whoever had come had taken only that. Not the photograph. Not her notebook. Just the fragment that connected Branson to the aria. The confession. She went at once to Inspector Caldwell. "I believe someone is trying to prevent the publication," she told him. "They're too late for the article. The copy has already been sent, but someone in Marlecombe is frightened. Or furious. Or both." Caldwell sat back. Someone who knew Branson? Someone protecting his memory? Or someone protecting their own reputation, Miss Marple said. Clara was trying to expose his history, but perhaps someone else was complicit in hiding it. "You mean Leonard Cross?" "Perhaps, but there may be someone else. Someone we've overlooked." That night, Miss Marple received a second note. This one was more direct. Cut from newspaper clippings, pasted together. "Do not print the Locket story. People forget for a reason. Let her rest." Miss Marple held it to the lamplight, studying the shape of the letters. The edges were uneven, the glue still faintly tacky. Whoever had written it had done so in haste. But it wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the church. Reverend Wexley was inside, replacing hymnals. He looked older than he had just weeks before. "She was my niece, Miss Marple," he said softly, after hearing why she had come. "But even I didn't know the whole of her pain." "She tried to spare you," Miss Marple said gently. "I found something," he said, "after the funeral, in her room." From a drawer in his desk, he pulled out a small notepad. The final page bore Clara's handwriting. "If anything happens, tell Miss Marple. The truth is already packed and ready. I will not be erased." Miss Marple felt the words settle like a stone in her chest. That evening, she sent a second envelope to Penelope. Drake this time, with a note and a postscript of her own. "They are trying to stop the story. That means we are closer than ever to the truth. Publish not in fear, but in remembrance." Clara Westbury's voice must be heard. As she sealed the envelope, the clock struck 8. Outside, the village seemed still, but somewhere someone was reading the paper and planning one final attempt to keep the past buried forever. Chapter 14. The editor's silence. The issue was scheduled to go to print on Tuesday. Miss Marple had received Penelope Drake's final confirmation the night before, folded into a crisp note. "We are ready. Presses roll at midnight. No changes now. The truth is coming." But on Wednesday morning, the Woman's Chronicle did not arrive. Miss Marple knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the village post office. Behind the counter, Mrs. Fairchild was staring at the shelves with a puzzled frown. "Odd morning," she muttered. "We usually get the Chronicle early. Never missed a post in 12 years. Miss Marple calmly asked, "Was anything else missing from today's delivery?" Mrs. Fairchild leaned in. "Actually, now you mention it, yes. A small brown envelope addressed to you. London postmark. Courier stamp. Van came, but it was one package short." Back home, Miss Marple made 2 calls. The first was to Penelope Drake's office in London. A nervous assistant answered. "Miss Drake?" she repeated. "She's not in. She didn't come in this morning. We assumed she was working from home, but no one's heard from her since Monday." "Was the magazine printed?" There was a pause. "Pulled. Miss Drake called the printers late Monday night and halted publication. Said there were concerns over unauthorized material. She sounded frightened." Miss Marple thanked the girl and hung up. So someone had gotten to Penelope, and the article was stopped. But who had enough reach to scare a London editor? That afternoon, Inspector Caldwell returned from a visit to London with grave news. "She's safe," he told Miss Marple, setting his hat aside. "Shaken, but safe," said someone confronted her outside her flat. claimed the article contained classified material, warned her she'd be sued, mentioned your name, my name. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. How odd. I don't believe I've ever dealt in state secrets. Caldwell said. It wasn't just a bluff. Whoever they were, they had documents, old ones. Claimed Branson was once involved with wartime broadcasts. Psychological propaganda. Post-WWI said exposing him could reopen wartime files best left closed. Miss Marple blinked. That's absurd. This isn't espionage. Exactly, Caldwell said. But someone doesn't want Branson's identity fully revealed. Which makes me wonder, what if Branson wasn't just a liar and a con-man, but something more? That evening, Miss Marple returned to her files. She pored over the photograph of Branson at the piano, the one Clara had copied. In the background, just over his shoulder, barely visible, a uniform cap resting on a piano bench. And not British, not military either, but something else. Miss Marple reached for her opera glasses. The cap bore a small, strange emblem like a coiled snake wrapped around a lyre. She stared at it for a long time. The next morning she visited Mr. Hargreaves, the oldest resident in Marleycombe, once a military band instructor and now nearly deaf. She showed him the photograph. He peered at it through a magnifying glass. That's not British issue, he said. I'd stake my medals on it. That's an Austrian musician's cap. Civilian corps. Pre-war. That's Vienna, not Leeds. Miss Marple felt a shiver pass through her. He lied about everything, she murmured. Even his name may not be his own. By dusk, Caldwell had traced the emblem through old immigration records. One match stood out. Johann Brands, a touring pianist and voice coach who had arrived in England in 1907, registered under a false name after political exile from Vienna. He had no criminal record in England, but he had vanished in 1914, only to reappear in 1921 as James Branson in Leeds. A perfect disappearing act. Miss Marple stood in the inspector's office, her hands clasped. So he wasn't just a conman, she said softly. He was an exile, a man with enemies, and perhaps government secrets of his own? Caldwell looked troubled. And someone still doesn't want that secret known. Clara found out, Miss Marple said. She didn't understand it. All but she knew he wasn't who he said he was. She was pulling at threads she couldn't see. And someone from outside Marleycombe feared what might unravel. Back home, Miss Marple unlocked a small wooden box in her sitting room. Inside was the first copy of Clara's story, typed, signed, and sealed in a plain envelope. She addressed it by hand, to be opened only in the event of my death. Consented. Quietly, to Penelope Drake once more, along with a note. They stopped the first attempt. Let them try again. Chapter 16. The Shadow at King's Cross. Train to London was delayed by 17 minutes, long enough for Miss Marple to enjoy a lukewarm cup of tea on the platform, but not so long as to shake her purpose. She had dressed plainly, wrapped her scarf twice, and taken her smallest handbag. In it, Clara's original notes, a duplicate photograph, and the remaining copy of the hollow locket's contents, safely hidden beneath a folded linen handkerchief. She arrived at King's Cross just after noon, the sky above London steel gray, the air humming with impatience. From the moment she stepped off the train, she knew someone was watching her. It wasn't dramatic. No trench coat, no newspaper with holes cut out. Just a man mid-30s, neat collar, too polished to be a local. He didn't follow closely, but he didn't stop either. At the cab stand, she paused deliberately. Glanced back, he paused too. Pretended to check his watch. Miss Marple turned and approached him without hesitation. Would you like to share the cab with me? She asked sweetly. He blinked. I know, I've to Baker Street?" she added casually. "Or perhaps somewhere more official?" His eyes narrowed. She smiled. "I've dealt with worse than shadows, young man. If you have something to say, you may as well come along." He hesitated for a full beat, then turned on his heel and vanished into the station crowd. Miss Marple didn't smile. She simply made her way into the next taxi and handed the driver a card. "Fleet Street, please. And don't dawdle." Penelope Drake looked pale when she opened her office door. Her fingers trembled slightly on the doorknob. "They threatened me," she said quietly. "Not just with lawyers. With people. I came home Monday night and my flat was disturbed. Not robbed, just inspected." Miss Marple nodded. "So I gathered. That's why I came." Penelope gestured toward a locked drawer. "I saved your copy. The envelope. I never opened it." "Good," Miss Marple said. "Then we'll open it together." They did slowly, carefully. Inside, Clara's original notes, a Vienna photograph, the folded sheet music fragment, and the new letter Miss Marple had. Enclosed. But there was something else. A thin, yellowed newspaper clipping Miss Marple had never seen before. Penelope frowned. "Did you add this?" "No," Miss Marple said. They unfolded it. The headline read, "Music Teacher in Murder Scandal, minus 1,908. Girl found dead after aria. Rehearsal. Suspect flees Vienna." A grainy photo below. Johann Brands, unmistakable even then, standing at a piano, smiling faintly beside a wide-eyed girl in a student's uniform. Miss Marple's heart dropped. Clara found this. She must have tucked it inside before sending it all. Penelope stared. He killed before. Long before Leeds. Long before Eliza. Miss Marple's voice was cold. And someone in England helped him disappear. Gave him a new name, a new life, someone with power and reach. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in a small hotel off Russell Square. Outside, the traffic was soft, the street lights golden. She wrote 2 letters, one to Inspector Caldwell, summarizing everything, the other, in her oldest, neatest handwriting, to a name she had not used in years, Sir Cedric Holdham, former Home Office, now retired, because she remembered. That name, whispered once during the war. She remembered he had connections. And she remembered he had once protected a foreign national with musical ties to both propaganda and scandal. She ended the letter with a single line. "Your ghost has killed again. You owe her peace." That night, someone attempted to enter Miss Marple's hotel room, but she had left her cane across the inner door latch, and a brass button ripped from a sleeve in the struggle was later found in the corridor. Chapter 17. Sir Cedric Answers the reply came by courier at sunrise. A plain envelope, heavy cream paper. No return address. But the signature at the bottom left no doubt. "Miss Marple, you are correct. I should have buried him myself. Meet me tonight. No police. Discretion is expected. The Bell and Lantern Club. 8 p.m. C." Huldah Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then, again, she had written to many men over the years. Vicars, colonels, doctors, once even a minor bishop, but never to a man who had the ability to erase a murderer from history. Sir Cedric Holdham had been a rising star in the Home Office during the interwar years. During the war, he was elevated to a quieter post, Cultural Affairs Liaison, which everyone understood to be code for propaganda, censorship, and quiet removals. If anyone helped Johann Brands become James Branson, it was Cedric Holdham. Now he was ready to talk. The Bell and Lantern was a gentleman's club in Mayfair, exclusive, velvet-carpeted, and faintly out of time. The Mater D didn't blink when Miss Marple gave her name. She was shown to a back room with dark walnut paneling and a single lamp that cast soft golden light on polished silver. Sir Cedric was waiting. He was in his 70s now. Still lean, still sharp-eyed. He stood when she entered. Miss Marple, or should I say, the woman who outfoxed 2 coroners and a government. "I've never sought to embarrass governments," she said. "Just stop murderers." He nodded. "And you have." He gestured to a chair. "Brands was a problem," he said. "A gifted pianist, yes, but also a manipulator. After Vienna, he fled. We intercepted him in Belgium. He offered information on the Austrians and the Germans. Names of sympathizers, coded broadcasts, musical scores with embedded messages. We tested some. They proved useful." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "So you bought his silence?" "We bought his services. He worked for us, quietly, in performances, on the radio, at private salons. He coached key figures, taught their wives, their children." "And what of the girl he killed?" "Unproven," Cedric said. "The case in Vienna never reached trial." "But you knew," she said sharply. Cedric exhaled. "We knew what?" "He might be. But in wartime, we used what we had." "And after?" "He outlived his usefulness. He assumed a new name in Leeds. We let it go, watched from a distance." "And Clara?" Cedric looked genuinely pained. "We didn't know she existed, not until 2 weeks ago, when a surveillance note crossed my desk. Marple, St. Mary Mead, investigating Westbury case. I pulled the file. I saw the name. I realized it had come back." Miss Marple leaned in. "Someone tried to silence me. Twice." "Not by my order," Cedric said quickly. "There are still others, in intelligence, in certain circles, who'd rather this be forgotten. It's embarrassing. Not criminal anymore, but awkward." "And what now?" she asked. Sir Cedric handed her a second envelope. "This is everything," he said. "His files, his movements. The coded broadcasts, the original Vienna police report. I've removed the redactions. Do with it what you will." Miss Marple accepted it wordlessly. "One thing," he added. "You've won, Miss Marple, but publishing it, that will bring scrutiny. Not just to Brands, but to Clara, to Eliza, even to you." Miss Marple stood. She died for the truth. "The least I can do is carry it the rest of the way." That night, she returned to her hotel and placed the envelope beneath her pillow. She did not sleep. The next morning, she sent a telegram to Penelope Drake. Full clearance received. Confirm printing immediately. Truth is armed. And a second to Inspector Caldwell. I am returning tomorrow. Please prepare a statement. You may want to reopen the original inquest. Branson's past was not just shameful. It was deadly. She left. Her hotel at noon. A dark car idled across the street. She did not approach it. She did not need to. She simply looked once, sharply, into the tinted window. And the car drove away. Chapter 18. The visitor in the garden, the taxi from Paddington, arrived in Marleycombe just before dusk. The air was heavy, the hedgerows soaked from an afternoon rain. Miss Marple stepped out, her hat slightly askew, a heavy envelope from Sir Cedric still tucked safely inside her handbag. As she neared her cottage gate, something caught her eye. A shadow moved in her garden. Deliberate. Slow. She paused. The figure didn't run, didn't hide. Instead, he stepped forward. A man in his late 50s, tall, lean, coat too formal for the countryside. In one hand, a pistol, polished, military issue. In the other, nothing but silence. Miss Marple, he said quietly, we need to talk. She didn't flinch. I rather thought we might, she said. He didn't give a name, but Miss Marple knew who he was. Major Lionel Greaves, formerly of military intelligence, now retired. His name had appeared once, faintly, in Sir Cedric's file, as the handler who received Brands in 1915. "You've stirred quite a mess," he said, gesturing for her to sit on the garden bench. "We had hoped this story would fade." "So had Clara Westbury," Miss Marple replied. "It cost her her life." Greaves exhaled. "You don't understand what men like Brands were involved in. What they were used for. War wasn't fought just with bullets. It was fought with voices, songs, ideas. Is that your defense?" She said, "That Brands was a necessary evil?" "I'm not here to justify him," Greaves said. "I'm here to contain the damage. You have files, originals. I want them." Miss Marple studied him. "And if I say no?" He looked at the gun, not threatening, just reminding. "You're not the first man to wave a weapon at me, Major," she said calmly. "But you will be the last to underestimate what I've prepared." She reached into her bag and pulled out a plain envelope. Not the envelope, but one nearly identical. She handed it over. Greaves snatched it, tore it open only to find blank papers, knitting patterns, and a rather detailed recipe for Dundee cake. His eyes narrowed. "Where's the real one?" "Already delivered," she said, smiling faintly. "To a lawyer in London, with a timed release to the press in the event of my sudden disappearance." Greaves froze. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Let me offer you a gentleman's option. Walk away, quietly, let the story unfold. Or try to stop it and ensure it spreads even further." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood. "You're cleverer than they warned," he muttered. She smiled. "I usually am." He tucked the gun into his coat and walked out. The gate. By morning, Miss Marple received word that The Woman's Chronicle had gone to print. The hollow locket was its cover story. Inside, Clara's letter, the Vienna clipping, the sheet music, and a small tribute penned by Penelope Drake. She did not shout. She did not scream. She simply persisted. "Clara Westbury is gone, but what she uncovered will not be buried again." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the village. Children were playing by the duck pond. The vicar nodded solemnly from his bicycle. And behind curtains, people whispered again, not in fear, but in awakening. A murderer had been unmasked. System had been exposed, and an old woman with sharp eyes and steady hands had turned the tide. Chapter 19. The name underlined twice. Chronicles issue hit newsstands across the country by mid-morning. By lunchtime. Marley Combe was buzzing. By nightfall, Inspector Caldwell knocked on Miss Marple's door, copy in hand, eyebrows lifted. "Just read it cover to cover," he said, thumbing through the final pages. "We may have to reopen more than one case. Clara's death, yes, but possibly Eliza Westbury's too." Miss Marple poured tea without a word. She had expected this. She knew what she was doing. She said gently, "Clara wanted justice. For her mother, yes, but also for the girls who never had a voice. Agnes Weller, the girl in Vienna. Others will never know by name." Caldwell sat. "There's something else. Penelope Drake forwarded an envelope to me this morning. Apparently, Clara posted it directly to the magazine 2 days before her death, marked to be opened after publication." He passed it to Miss Marple. Inside was a folded, handwritten letter. "A final message. To whoever carries this forward. If the Locket story sees the light, then I have one more truth to tell. Something I couldn't prove, but I knew deep in my bones. My mother didn't just know James Branson. She feared him. And she didn't die of illness. Not exactly. Her accident was a carefully crafted ending. I confronted someone about it. Not Branson. Not Margaret Cross. The person who helped keep it all quiet was someone local. Someone close to her. And close to me. He told me to stop digging. The last time we spoke, he said, if your mother couldn't fight him, what makes you think you can? His name is, the name was written in ink, twice underlined, the pen pressing hard enough to leave an impression on the next page. Reverend Cyril Wexley Caldwell read the name aloud and exhaled. The vicar? Miss Marple's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. He was very close to Eliza, she said softly. Far closer than he ever admitted, even after her death. And Clara, Caldwell added, if he knew, if he covered it up, that's more than silence. Miss Marple's mind returned to little things. Reverend Wexley's gentle redirections, his reluctance to speak of Clara's investigation, and the time she'd asked to see the church visitor's book. And he had claimed it was missing. Too neat. Too rehearsed. Caldwell stood, already reaching for his coat. I'll need to bring him in. No, Miss Marple said sharply. Not yet. Caldwell froze. Let me speak with him, she continued. If we go straight to questioning, he'll shut down. But if I can draw him out... Caldwell looked doubtful. Inspector, she said gently, I've come this far. Trust me one more time. An hour later, Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage. Reverend Wexley opened the door, dressed not in his usual cassock, but in plain clothes, already prepared, she suspected, for what was coming. He motioned her inside without a word. They sat opposite each other in the quiet parlor. I think you know why I'm here, she said. His eyes, usually soft with kindness, were sharp now, alert, almost cold. You read her letter. I did. He didn't deny it. He simply leaned back. She came to me after finding the photograph, he said. Told me Branson had ruined Eliza, that he'd seduced her when she was barely more than a girl. When I found out Eliza was pregnant, I tried to convince her to marry someone else, anyone else, but she wouldn't. He paused. She wrote to Branson. He never replied. Then, one night, she fell down the stairs, Miss Marple said quietly. Or so we were told. He nodded. That's what the coroner said. But I was there. I heard them argue. She told him she would tell the truth. He pushed her. Not hard, but enough. Miss Marple's voice trembled slightly. And you didn't go to the police? I buried her, he said flatly. And I buried the truth. Clara never knew her father. I thought that was mercy. But when Clara began digging, you tried to silence her. I warned her, he said. Told her the world wouldn't believe her. That the system always protects the abuser, not the victim. I didn't kill her, but I didn't help her either. Miss Marple stood. Then you'll help now. Reverend Wexley nodded, slowly. I'll make a statement. I should have done it years ago. As Miss Marple reached the door, he said, almost in a whisper, You think you're solving a murder. But what you've really done, Miss Marple, is resurrect a century of silence. She turned to him. Her voice was clear and steady. Good. Silence is what killed them. Chapter 20. Fire and ink. 2 days after Reverend Wexley's quiet, trembling confession, Inspector Caldwell reopened both cases. The death of Clara Westbury, and officially now, the suspicious death of Eliza Westbury, 23 years earlier. It wasn't just a formality. The vicar's statement, added to Clara's final letter, was enough to revise the historical record, but not everyone was pleased. By Monday morning, the backlash began. The bishop's office issued a carefully worded notice of deep regret over Reverend Wexley's decision to resign from his post. The local parish council, embarrassed by the national attention, tried to keep it all quiet. They failed, because copies of the Woman's Chronicle were selling faster than any issue in its history. One arrived at the Marleycombe police station with a note scrawled on its cover. You've opened a grave. Keep digging and you'll end up in one. Inspector Caldwell placed the issue in a sealed evidence bag. We traced the fingerprint. He told Miss Marple. Partial. Smudged. But it matches a known associate of Branson's, an assistant who once toured with him under another alias. He's still alive, living in Kent. Name of Tobias Gray. Miss Marple blinked. I remember that name. Clara mentioned him in her notes. The man with the key? She believed he had helped hide Branson's earliest papers. Caldwell nodded. If he's still protecting Branson's legacy, he's desperate. He may have even known what really happened to Eliza. Then we must speak with him. Already arranged, Caldwell said. But there's something else. That same day, Penelope Drake's office caught fire. A back room, where files from the Hollow Locket story had been stored. The fire brigade arrived in time to contain the damage, but the file cabinets had been forced open, and the copies destroyed. Arson, clean. Professional Miss Marple stared at the singed remains, which Penelope brought with her to Marleycombe later. That evening, they burned the backups, Penelope said bitterly. Only reason I didn't lose the lot was because I sent a copy to my solicitor. God help us if I hadn't. Someone is trying to erase Clara a second time, Miss Marple murmured. First through lies, now through fire. Penelope looked up. Are you frightened? Yes, Miss Marple said simply. But I'm also finished with being quiet. The next morning, Caldwell and Miss Marple traveled to Kent, arriving at a narrow cottage on a wind-blown hill. Tobias Gray was already waiting in the garden, as if he knew this moment would come. Old, stooped, but alert. I was loyal to a monster, he said, before either could ask a question. And I've paid for it every day. Inside his small sitting room, he unlocked an old travel case and withdrew a stack of letters, fragile, brown-edged, and tied with fading twine. All from Brands, before he changed his name. Letters to women, some desperate, some cruel. One. He held it up, written to Eliza. Caldwell read it aloud. You must stay quiet. If the child is born, you will destroy us both. I am not the man you think I am. You must understand. Some women simply do not survive scandal. Signed, J.B. below it, one final note, written in another hand. He came again, said he would push me if I tried to speak. I believe he means it this time. Miss Marple stood. That's the motive, she said softly. And that's the threat. Caldwell nodded grimly. We'll reopen her death officially. We'll name him. Gray looked at them with sunken eyes. You'll never erase what he did, but maybe you can stop the legacy. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but resolute. We already have. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The shadows were long, the village still. But inside her handbag, she carried the final letter Eliza ever wrote, the one no one had dared read, until now. Tomorrow, it would be published in full. No more secrets. No more silence. And the hollow locket, once just a trinket of grief, had become a key to justice.